All right, looks like people are joining. It's just about on the hour, so I'll go ahead and provide the introduction to today's webinar. First of all, I'd like to welcome everyone. This is the first of 4 webinars on exploring vulnerability assessments for the Four Corners and Upper Rio Grande regions. Today's webinar is on native fish and riparian systems resources. My name is Mary McFadden, and I'm with the Southern Rockies Landscape Conservation Cooperative, and I'll be the host for the webinars. Megan Friggins, a research ecologist who's with the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station in Albuquerque, and her colleagues will be leading the webinars. A couple housekeeping items before we begin. Just to remind you, please mute your phone. Everybody comes in unmuted, so it's critical to have your phone muted. And if you hear some wacko echoing sounds, it means you need to shut off your computer speakers. There's also, some weird feedback going on. So one way to turn off your computer speakers is on your keyboard, but you can also do it by selecting that green speaker icon at the top of your screen. And if you want to take a second, please introduce yourself in the chat box. I'd like to find out who everybody is and what they, well, not so much what they do, but who their affiliation and perhaps your position title. We are recording this webinar, and we'll let you know when that recording, as well as the presentation slides, are posted on the Southern Rockies LCC website. If you'd like to learn more about the other 3 webinars that we'll be hosting, as well as the upcoming Adaptation Forum workshops, you can open the web links that are located in the lower left corner of your screen. All right, Megan, I think we're ready to go. Are you and Max ready?
Yes, we are. So speaking of odd noises, we have a bit of construction going on in our building. So if you're hearing odd thumps and such every now and again, that is nothing to be alarmed about. So hopefully we are having a quiet lunch hour here for everybody involved. It seems quieter right now. So. Okay, so I'm here. I work with the Rocky Mountain Research Station. I'm a research ecologist there, as Mary said. But I'm here with Max Smith, who's a research associate with the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and he's come down from Oregon, where he usually resides, to talk about the first of 4 vulnerability assessments that we have conducted for the Four Corners and Upper Rio Grande landscapes within the Southern Rockies LCC. And so as the title here shows you, we're going to be talking about the riparian corridors and native fish assessments. And so for today, we have about an hour and 15 minutes scheduled for this webinar. We hope to have some discussion time or question and answer time towards the end. But please feel free to put any questions up in these chat boxes that will be available on your screen at any point, and we can address questions then or save them for the end. We also will be asking you to fill out a poll and to provide some input at certain points within this presentation. So please feel free to comment and give us your feedback and ideas. So this is the agenda, I think, that we have for today. I'm going to introduce really briefly the Four Corners and Upper Rio Grande assessments, how we got to this place today. Then I'll spend about 15 minutes, I hope, talking about the methods, and this is to provide a little bit of background as to why we've done things the way we have. And then Max is going to take over and give you all the interesting information about the results from our assessment process. And then we'll close out with a little couple slides with takeaway messages, and then hopefully be able to open it up for discussion and comments and things like that. So let me just find my arrow. Okay, so the goals for this webinar are, 1, to provide an overview of the assessment results. This will be the first time that we are providing our complete product, and so we are excited about that. We also are open to suggestions on how to improve these products, and as I go through the presentation, I'll talk a lot about this and opportunities to comment and things to consider with these assessments. In particular, we're interested in identifying any additional data sets or needs that you all that are participating today might be interested in seeing in these assessments. And our plan is to incorporate the feedback that we get from you in preparation for upcoming adaptation forums, where we will really dive into the details of these assessments. Today will be an overview, kind of give you a feeling for what it is and how it works. We're going to have these adaptation forums where we really start to use them to try to achieve some objectives. And so we'll incorporate a feedback not only to prepare for those forums, but as well just to finish these assessments and make a finalized product. So to begin, the Southern Rockies LCC, as probably many of you know, is engaged in this adaptive management process to develop shared conservation objectives and landscape scale adaptation strategies. And as part of this, the LCC staff has been doing a lot of interviews and working with working groups and their steering committee to identify focal resources and focal landscapes within the LCC boundaries to begin to identify goals and objectives. As part of this process, they partner with the RMRS to do vulnerability assessment for focal resources within 2 landscapes. During this process, we have had a round of adaptation forums in the spring of 2016 where we worked with various stakeholders from our 2 regions, the Four Corners and the Upper Rio Grande, to get some information that would really help us fine-tune our strategy for developing these assessments. And we're going to be having another round, of adaptation forums at the end of August and beginning of September, where we hope to use the assessments to move on to a different part of the process in this strategy. So this slide is showing you the focal resources that we have targeted for our assessments and kind of a close-up of those 2 landscapes, the Four Corners and Upper Rio Grande. So we have stream flow, native fish, and riparian corridors, the topic of today's webinar. Then we'll have mule deer and elk, which is the topic of tomorrow's webinar. And then we also have assessments for pinyon juniper woodlands and sage steppe habitat. And so the items that you see in kind of the blue font there are items that were added after our last adaptation forums based on feedback that we got about interests and needs from those participants. The ones in black were our initial targets, and they correspond to some of the focal resources that you see on the LCC's main page. So now I'm going to talk about the methods, move into this next study. But before I do, we would like to survey the participants on the phone today to get a little bit more of a feeling, or I should say poll, sorry Mary, to get a bit more of a feeling on where you're coming from and why you're here today. And that helps us to maybe tailor our conversation a little bit. So if you go ahead and fill these out, that would be great. And I don't think it should take too long, but we'll give you a few seconds. Okay. Numbers are still moving. Some of them are switching around. Yeah, you have to. Okay, so the first question, I suppose I should go through this. Did you participate in our first round of Adaptation Forum workshops last year in Durango or Albuquerque? It looks like the majority were not participants at that, and that is fine. It would be great to continue to reach out to new people and get additional feedback. These assessments will be as good as the information that we have going into it, and so perhaps we can entice you to go to the next round of Adaptation Forums after this presentation. So that kind of corresponds to our second question there. Are you here today because you plan to attend one of the upcoming forums? It looks like some of you are considering it. And then we do have some may go to both. That's great. Okay, perhaps we can move those percentages by the end of today too. Okay, and then finally, we wanted to know a little bit about whether you were interested in a specific region. It looks like we definitely have a lot of people that are working in the Upper Rio Grande area. And then, of course, I didn't mention this earlier, but Green River Basin is the focus of another effort being conducted by Dave Theobald and others, similar kind of assessment process, though I guess Kevin Johnson would have a lot more information about that. And then the Colorado Plateau. Okay, so moving on, we will start talking about the mechanics of our vulnerability assessment. Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm going to begin by showing you our framework for the landscape level vulnerability assessment of focal resources. And so this is based on a very common way to consider vulnerability assessments, particularly when we're considering climate change impacts. But these assessments are not solely focused on climate change. We we're focused on issues, disturbances, threats in general that might affect these focal resources. And so on your left-hand side, we have the elements of our vulnerability assessment framework. We have exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Then I've put the definitions that we're using in this particular project, and then I'm giving a couple examples of the spatial data or indicators that we use to measure those individual elements. Excuse me. And so importantly here, this is a spatially explicit vulnerability assessment. Our output is maps, and so that's a strong theme, as you'll see in all of the data sets and considerations of what we're put together today. So just to go through this, we have exposure, which is defined as the external threat to a target species, system, or place. If you recall, we have a pretty diverse set of focal resources that we're looking at. And some of the kinds of threats and disturbances that we included in our analyses were those related to human impacts like urbanization or maybe roads, natural disturbances, both the magnitude and frequency depending on what the aim of the assessment was, and of course climate change, which is always present in many of these assessments. Sensitivity regards the qualities that make the target more susceptible to negative impacts from a disturbance or a threat. And so this can be considered in a couple different ways. Commonly, it's considered the traits or conditions that are associated with an increased negative response to that exposure. A good example might be if you have a species that's sensitive to high stream temperatures, and there are streams where there's not a lot of vegetation, and then there's streams that do have a lot of vegetation. And you could say that the fish or this animal, sorry, I don't want to take over Max's presentation, but the one that's living in the stream that has less vegetation is going to be more sensitive to increases in air temperature rises because there's going to be less buffering, or it'll just experience the water temperature will rise more quickly. The other way of looking at sensitivity is as an indicator of potential cost of disturbance. And so this is kind of it's based on the value of something. And an example of that might be where you have two watersheds that are at some risk of fire, and one watershed has threatened and endangered species, and the other watershed does not have threatened and endangered species. And so in some assessments, you might consider that watershed that has the threatened and endangered species as a sensitivity. The manager who's managing for biodiversity is going to incur a higher cost if fire occurs in those two watersheds in the one that contains that valued resource. So adaptive capacity is the ability of the target to cope with a disturbance or a threat. And again, this can be kind of an intrinsic condition, a trait or condition associated with resilience. It can also be the potential for successful management intervention. If we think about those watersheds that are exposed to some fire again, maybe one of those watersheds is inaccessible, it's full of steep canyons, and you have some restrictions on mechanical use, whereas in the other watershed you're able to implement thinning, which can really reduce the impact of fire exposure in the system. In some vulnerability assessments, you could consider that capacity as an indication of adaptive capacity. And so there's a variety of ways in which we can look at these different elements and how they're put together, and how they're put together in a final assessment depends on the scope and the goals of the user. For instance, many species-level assessments will really focus on those trait-based indicators of sensitivity and adaptive capacity. But there's also other systems, one in which, in particular, which I'm working on, that's very much focused on the potential for management intervention to reduce vulnerability to changes in fire regimes as a result of climate. And so in that system, adaptive capacity almost entirely refers to management and how that changes the ultimate impact of these other things. And that allows the users of that system to really hone in on what they're interested in, and that's different management strategies. And so for the assessments that we're going to be talking about in these next 4 webinars, we considered all of these ways in which you might measure exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, and used our best judgment to select the correct ones for a particular focal area and particular focal interest. Somewhat given the feedback of the Adaptation Forums at first round, but also we haven't been given a real strong goal as to whether it's management or species within a certain area. So we just tried to make this as flexible as possible by using a full range of these types of measurements. So here I'm going to talk about, and then I'll be done and Max can start his, I'm going to talk about how we get from the data gathering step to actually quantifying vulnerability. And so what I'm showing you here is how the elements are put together. You have exposure and sensitivity, which collectively measure an impact of some disturbance on some system. And then by looking at that impact in reference to the adaptive capacity of that system, you can gauge vulnerability. So if you have a watershed that has high adaptive capacity, then it's going to be less vulnerable to some impact than a watershed that has lower adaptive capacity. And so the first thing that we have to do to be able to use the system is to gather data. And as we do that, we assess its relevance to measuring a response of the system. And then we have to assign it to one of these elements. It's either a measure of exposure or sensitivity or adaptive capacity. And where we assign the elements can vary too, and I mention this because you'll see that there's a diversity of ways across our different focal resources that we treat things like road density, for instance. Depending on whether we want to focus on how it's impacting the system or how a system may be resilient to something, we could consider it either an exposure element or an element of adaptive capacity. And I think that that will be more clear with real examples later. So once we've gathered the data, we have to create indices to measure exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And I'll talk about this for a couple slides later on. And then we combine those indices to estimate vulnerability. So it's kind of the overview of the process. So a little bit about gathering data. We outlined this criteria here to help us focus in on relevant data sets. It needed to be spatially explicit, of course. We also only brought in data that was available across the entire focal landscape. There's a lot of good studies and information out there that was available on a more local scale, and the only reason it wasn't included is we needed to be able to have full coverage. But there's lots of good stuff out there, and we do review that in our reports, which Max will talk about a little bit later on. It also had to be meaningful, kind of getting back at that relevance. It needed to relate to either a response or an exposure element. We also needed to be able to gauge the uncertainty within the data set, and I'll talk about that in more detail as well. But in some cases, we just have to acknowledge the uncertainty and to make sure that you, the people that might be using this data, also are able to understand the uncertainty. And for some of our measures, we actually have maps that we can, or data layers that we can put on our maps that show areas where we're more or less certain of certain types of response. And so we use those where we can, and that was great. And then finally, we really tried to find data sets that were used or produced by the LCC stakeholders. This is in part to leverage these data sets and all the work that's been done, which helps us identify what work maybe we still need and where there's gaps. But also, it is our hope that by using what others are using and keeping in the same language, that these products will have more utility, that they'll merge in easily with what folks are already doing out there. So there's challenges with combining existing data sets, and I've listed 3 of the primary ones that we've run into. This is not a necessarily complete list, but first of all, the resolution and scale of many of the data sets that you might use to measure these elements can differ, and they may not always match the management needs. So for each of the assessments that we'll talk about in these webinars, we tried to pick a scale of measurement that would best enable us to look at differences across the landscape. So they're not local scale results that we're presenting, but they give us enough detail that we can distinguish between areas within our focal landscapes, and that also don't overreach some of the capacity of the underlying data sets. If they are at 2/4 of a resolution, you're not gaining anything by trying to make a very fine resolution data product from that. There's also uncertainties and assumptions underlying each of the data sets. You know, there's methodological differences, there's knowledge gaps, there's terminology differences. And so to some extent, our criteria for selecting data, we tried to weed through a little bit of that. But also by using a vulnerability assessment framework, which is designed to somewhat deal with variations in data sets and uncertainty, we are hoping to also deal with that. And so a large component of what, well, I shouldn't say a large component, but there's definitely going to be a session during our adaptation forums where we really explore this topic of uncertainty and the types of uncertainty that can come from this type of process and within the data sets, as well as how people deal with that. And then we'll look at these assessment results in breakout groups for each topic and really begin to explore what uncertainties are unacceptable, which ones do we need to do something about, and which maybe aren't such a big deal. And so that will be a real benefit of being able to sit down and work through these together at the forums. And then finally, I haven't mentioned this yet, but this is a big one. There's, of course, uncertainties related to the climate projections. And that's not only with the process of trying to predict the future, which is not a perfect process, right, but with the fact that we're trying to combine data sets that have themselves use different ways to reduce uncertainty related to different climate models, different emission scenarios, different time periods, all the things that those of you that work with climate data know about. And so for the most part, we, in presenting this information today and in our reports, have chosen what I'm calling a middle-of-the-road type scenario. And we're only doing one at this point, but if feedback is such that you guys would like to see more of a bracketed situation, we can do that as well. But the reasoning being is that a lot of our data sets use ensemble data with a particular emission scenario, and so we tried to match, if we had more options in other data sets, we tried to match those ensembles. And we've really focused on the near to mid-century periods when we're talking about climate data, because we felt that that would probably be more relevant to a lot of management planning processes. And so we do have the capacity to give you a wider range of potential outcomes on the climate data. But I think look through what we've done on these assessments to this point and see whether that would be useful or whether we're representing well enough with this kind of middle of the road, not too extreme, not too little climate projection data that we're using so far. Hopefully I'm representing that well, Max. Yep. So he's nodding, so I guess that's pretty good. Okay, so I have to mention a little bit about the indices, and then we're pretty much done here. We're using a simple non-weighted indice to sum up all these different data sets. And so just as this yellow equation showing you each of the data sets that contribute to the exposure measure contribute a value of 1 or nothing if it's not relevant. And then we add up all those ones to give us a cumulative score. So the higher the score, the more threats or issues facing a particular watershed, if that's our unit of analysis. So there's pros and cons to this type of approach. Kind of simple, non-weighted score is easy to interpret, easy to manipulate on the fly, and they've been pretty well proven as able to identify relative differences amongst targets, and particularly in landscape analyses amongst areas within a landscape. And they are also able to, when you use them in a system like a vulnerability assessment framework like this, to identify more complicated interactions. And we'll explore that as well in more detail at the Adaptation Forums. So there's some cons, though, here, too. The score, the system, your index, is only going to be as good as the data that goes into it. So it may be biased or misleading if your data has biases or are not maybe representative of what they need. There's also a process that we use where we determine thresholds where something does get a score of 1 versus not a score of 1. How is it contributing? And so if we haven't done that right in that step, there could be some bias in the results that you see. And that's something that you'll have an opportunity to comment on later as well. Also, we're not considering differential impacts, and that's maybe a big one. Is there something amongst the exposure data sets or the sensitivity data sets that's really much more important than the others? You know, think about this as you're scrutinizing the results today, and let us know what you think. And then the final con here is it assumes equal certainty and quality of the underlying data. And so, you know, I think everybody tries to do really good when they're producing data, but of course there's some that are more robust than others. However, even though this is a con, it's actually, it's not entirely a bad thing, because the way this kind of scoring system works, no one data set's really driving the overall pattern. You know, it's an average, essentially. And so that allows us to to maybe reduce some of the bias that may happen between different data sets. Okay, so this is a schematic just showing us how we go from that data process to the vulnerability rank, and this is, you'll see a lot of the results and you won't have to really look at this again. But along the bottom of the screen is a shorthand version, data, it gets converted, added, so you can just see the process overall. What I'm showing you in the boxes is an example, kind of a mini example for how we would get from point A to point B on the exposure score. So we have a couple data sets there, departure and temperature and road density, let's say, and then we have to translate that into our score for our index. And so where we could find from the literature or other expertise, we would determine thresholds that were based on the values themselves. Where there wasn't that type of information, we tried to be as objective as possible and use things like if there was an increase in departure temperature, then that watershed was given a score of 1. If the road density was in the top 25 percentile, it was given a score of 1. So once you've done all this for all your data sets, and I think we range from 4 to 8 different exposures and various, I don't know, Max might have more. But once you gather all this, you add these up and you end up with an exposure score in that third box that you see there. A similar process generates that sensitivity score, and then you add those two to measure your potential impact. And so it's just a simple additive one-to-one relationship. You've gone through a similar process for adaptive capacity, and these two things are then overlaid to represent vulnerability. And how that's done is not an additive thing. We actually use this matrix that you see where along the left-hand side you can see we have our adaptive capacity scores. So the greater the score, the better, the greater the coping capacity. Across the top we have our impact, our combined exposure and sensitivity scores. The greater the score here, the greater the impact, so it's kind of a negative thing. And the way we read this is, is that as we have increasing impact and lower adaptive capacity, you have an increasing vulnerability. And so we use this matrix essentially to create this color-coded map that you see on the right-hand side of your, on your screen there, excuse me. And as you can see, you can easily identify areas that are highly vulnerable versus less vulnerable. And so this can help us identify needs in the landscape. Now, we're really focused on vulnerability today, and that's how Max is going to talk about his stuff. But there's other ways that we can use these data sets to look at different aspects in our landscape. And so here is another matrix, a color-coded matrix, but it is designed to highlight potential conservation opportunity areas. And so now we have adaptive capacity across the top, and impact on the side. And the way this is supposed to be visualized is that as you move to those darker blue shades, you have an increasing potential for management success because you have areas that have high adaptive capacity and perhaps low impact. And so if you noticed on the last slide of vulnerability, we were easily able to identify those hot spots of vulnerability, but then everything that wasn't vulnerable was kind of the same color. Well, here we can start to gain information about those less vulnerable areas and where, in fact, maybe we'll have refugia or good areas for restoration because of what the vulnerability assessment results have shown. Okay, and so I don't see any questions, and my part is done. So now Max is going to just take over.
All right, thanks, Megan. So I'll give a little background for our assessment of stream flows, native fish, and riparian ecosystems. So when we started working on this project, we initially went in with a literature review concerning stream flows and native fish, and then we looked at the literature and we participated in the Adaptation Forums, and after getting input from others, we decided to narrow our focus to 2 specific resources for spatial assessment. And that's what I'll be talking about for the rest of this talk. And so one of the resources is the Coldwater fish habitat, and we selected this resource because there's a high cultural and economic value placed on coldwater fisheries in the regions. And this is because many of these regions have native fish such as cutthroat trout, both the Rio Grande cutthroat trout pictured here and Colorado River cutthroat trout, as well as the Apache trout in the Little Colorado Basin, which is a federally threatened species. And so because of these fish, there's a lot of information out there about habitat requirements for trout and other species, and there have been several projects projecting changes in stream flow, volume, and in stream temperature in these regions. And now, in addition to these sensitive and threatened trout species, there are several non-game species that are federally protected as well, such as the endangered Zuni bluehead sucker pictured here, and the Little Colorado River spine dace. Our second focal resource is riparian corridors, and these are the strips of riparian vegetation that are often formed along streams in the region. And we got a lot of feedback at the workshops and the adaptation forums about the concern there is for maintaining these corridors as migratory pathways for different species and as for habitat for breeding birds and other wildlife and year-round resident species. And so these corridors support really high diversity of plants and animals, and they're also critical habitat for riparian obligates, which are federally protected. And here's the 3 of the protected vertebrates in these corridors. We've got the yellow-billed cuckoo, the southwestern little flycatcher, and the New Mexico jumping mouse, all of which have critical habitat designated in riparian ecosystems. And so again, here's the focal regions that we're using for this assessment. The Four Corners region is composed of the San Juan River Basin and the Little Colorado River Basin, while the Upper Rio Grande is largely composed of the Rio Grande drainage, as well as the Upper Pecos River, and there's some portions which also fall into the Upper Arkansas and Canadian River drainages as well. The Four Corners region has 2 basins, as I mentioned, and these basins differ a little bit in hydrological characteristics. The Little Colorado Basin lacks the extensive high mountain ranges that the San Juan Basin has, but it has very important groundwater dynamics. It has really extensive karst systems, so there's a lot of groundwater movement under the surface, and there are extensive aquifers throughout the basin as well, which store flows that are important for the threatened and endangered fish species. And the San Juan River Basin has many high peaks, as you're most likely aware, so it stores a lot of snow during the wintertime and has a much larger surface water component than the Little Colorado. And because of these differences, we assess them somewhat differently in our full report, which will be available soon. You can see some differences between these basins in that report, but for now, we'll just combine them for the region. The Upper Rio Grande region also has the high peaks of the San Juan Mountains fueling many of the streams, and there's several of ranges also in northern New Mexico that feed into the streams, but these are not as high as the San Juans, and they don't store as much water. So as a result, most of the water that passes through the Upper Rio Grande region originates in Colorado. So many of the streams in these regions can fall into one of 2 categories. We have coldwater tributaries, which are the native trout habitats, and then we also have main stems and lower portions of tributaries, which are habitat for fishes that require more turbid or warm water conditions, and they also support many of the extensive riparian corridors. So we'll focus on main stems and for the riparian corridors, but the cold water fishes, we're looking mostly at the upper tributaries. And so to begin the spatial assessment, we created several base maps for the fish habitat and the riparian corridors. And the units that we use for these maps are the NHD plus stream segments. So these are segments of varying lengths that are that each have their own cutoffs where different tributary streams come in. And we use, for the cold water fish habitat, we use segments that are designated as perennial streams, since that's what the native fish require. And for the riparian corridors, we have both perennial streams and intermittent streams. And neither of these maps are meant to be to reflect distribution for the fish habitat or riparian corridors, and they're definitely overrepresented by these maps. But since this is a sort of a large-scale landscape assessment, we feel it's not important to represent exactly where these resources are located, but more where the threats and the vulnerabilities are sort of collected. And so here's a table showing our assessment data. And as you can see by the color coding here, some indicators that we used applied solely to fish, some were for riparian corridors, and several of them were used for both assessment types. And we selected these data based on results of earlier work, such as the Dolores River Trout Unlimited Chapters assessment that came out recently, and by work by Hill et al., who assembled the StreamCat database, which is where we got many of our data that were used for these assessments. And so there's plenty of data out there that probably could improve these assessments, but we don't have that yet. And some of these data include the distribution of non-native fish, which is a large stressor for native fish populations. And there are some species distribution models available for the Colorado Basin, but they're not completed yet for the Rio Grande Basin, so we're not using that yet, but hopefully we'll get those soon so that we can add that as a component to the models. And groundwater levels and the extent of aquifers would be useful, especially in the little Colorado Basin, but we haven't found complete coverage of that yet. And riparian vegetation conditions influenced by many factors such as grazing, non-native species, wildfire, and other impacts, and that kind of coverage would be useful as well. A big one for the native fish is disease, such as whirling disease, which is a big stressor to native populations and also is affected by stream temperatures. So we're on the lookout for whirling disease distribution. And then we have distribution of sensitive fish species in our data sets, but we don't have that data for riparian, terrestrial riparian species such as birds. And so we're looking at ways to get that data into our maps as well. And then finally, energy development clearly has effects on the water quality and quantity, and these data would be important to use, both current rates of energy development and projected future rates that can be modeled under different scenarios would be helpful. So at this time, we can bring up some different survey boxes, which can be used by you to let us know if there's any variables you think that we should include in these assessments, or if there's any variables that we should sort of interpret differently or make other changes. Feel free to type that in those boxes. And if you have questions about the individual variables, we'll address them at the end of the presentation. And there's the 3 boxes there. Each box represents a different assessment components. We have one for indicators, for sensitivities, and one for adaptive capacity. So if you have any thoughts about these elements, feel free to use the boxes. And so now I'll go over some of the data that we use for the coldwater fish exposure. So we used several data sets that were compiled by others at the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and that are used to project changes in stream flows. So the Rocky Mountain Research Station Western Stream Metric data set includes changes in mean annual flow, and these are modeled for each stream segment. And so we looked at these data and we coded it so that each stream segment receives a 1 if the projected mean annual flow around the year 2040 is less than the projected historical rates of flow. And we also did this with summer flow, and we also used stream temperature projections, which are made by the Norwest Project through the research station. And these are predicted stream temperatures for each reach around the year 2040. And if there's an increase in temperature above the ideal trout's sort of spawning temperature range, which is about 9 to 11 degrees Celsius, then if we saw that increase, then we coded that segment as a 1 as well. So some of the other elements that we used were pollution sources, which include point sources of pollution and Superfund sites. We looked at road density and road crossings, which can affect both stream pollution and the fragmentation of habitat if fish are unable to use road crossings to migrate through the streams. We also included a soil erosion index, which is an indicator of pollution via sedimentation, and then nitrogen deposition, which can influence water quality as well. And so we used a different set for exposure for the riparian corridors. We used mean annual flow and mean summer flow, as we did with the fish data sets. We also looked at changes in the peak flow date, since reproduction of riparian vegetation is often heavily tied to stream flow peaks and their timing. We assumed that a change in peak flow date of 14 days or greater would influence the reproduction of riparian vegetation. So we so we use that as an exposure. And we also looked at changes in riparian cover, and we used land fire data sets to compare compare the percentage of cover of riparian vegetation within a catchment between what's expected to be there through the biophysical modeling with what is currently there through remote sensing. And so if there's less there than expected, we use that as an indication of a decline in riparian vegetation cover and coded the segments to reflect that. We also included agricultural cover within a riparian buffer, developed land cover, and introduced vegetation cover within those buffers as well, because changes in land cover can affect the amount of riparian vegetation that's present, as well as the dynamics of the streams that the vegetation surrounds. And then we included density of dams, since dams alter the timing and volume of water flows in these areas. And as Megan mentioned earlier, we used this process that's illustrated here to build our cumulative scores. We started with maps of the original data that I just showed you, and then we recoded them to reflect an effect or no effect of each indicator for each exposure. And then these maps were then overlaid to come up with a cumulative score, which we then transformed on a 1 to 10 basis. And then these maps show us where the different levels of exposure are located. So here's some of our final exposure index maps. And if you'd like, you can enlarge these maps by clicking on the 4 arrows at the upper right-hand corner of the screen. And so for coldwater fish exposure, we found that there were some clusters of areas with high exposure, which are indicated by the orange or the red stream segments. And these clusters were located in the San Juan Mountains, or the Four Corners region, and in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in the upper Rio Grande. Next, here's the cumulative exposure index for riparian corridors. And we found that some stream segments with high or very high exposure rates are located along the Little Colorado River in the San Juan Basin, the upper San Juan River and some of the San Juan tributaries, and then along the Rio Grande and some tributaries in the San Luis Valley of Colorado.
So we see we have a question in one of our boxes there, and so from Ian, I'll let you answer that,
Sure.
Max, because he would know better than I.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct. We did use, the question is, do we compare riparian cover and land fire between the BPS and the EVT? And that's correct, we did. We compared the biophysical model vegetation with the EVT data. The next data set is for cold water fish sensitivity. And so for these data, we used a distribution of different fish species. And the first one were presence of native trout. So these are Apache trout, Rio Grande cutthroat trout, and Colorado River cutthroat trout. And if we found evidence that a stream segment supported any of these species, it was coded as 1. And again, this suggests that segments with these species have a higher value, and there's more to lose if they are affected by disturbance. And then next we look at sensitive fish species, and these are non-trout species which are sensitive, but not yet federally listed. And these are mostly chubs or suckers that are located in each basin. And then finally, the threatened and endangered species that are not trout, and these are the Zuni bluehead sucker and the Little Colorado River spine dace. And so the next sensitivity indicator was riparian vegetation cover. Again, this is the one I showed earlier with the land cover. And so if the land fire data, so if there was a decrease in vegetation cover that was predicted by this land fire data, then we coded the segment as 1. And we used elevation as a measure of sensitivity as well in previous assessments. They've shown that stream reaches with a elevation below 7,500 feet are more sensitive to warming. We included that in this component. And we also included density of dams. If dams are located in the watersheds, it'll be more difficult for trout to migrate to find climate refugia. So we included density of dams there. And then finally, we used fire risks. So we assume that streams that have high or very high wildfire risk within their catchment are more sensitive to effects of post-fire flooding or debris flows. And for riparian corridor sensitivity, we also used the fire risk that I just described. And we also looked at threatened and endangered riparian obligate species, and these are the 3 species I showed earlier: the yellow-billed cuckoo, the southwestern willow flycatcher, and the New Mexico jumping mouse. And then we also looked at deciduous or riparian vegetation located within riparian buffers, and we assumed that the stream reaches that have either deciduous or wetland vegetation are going to be more highly valued over reaches that have just upland vegetation surrounding them, because this vegetation type is important habitat. It's rare on the landscape, and it can protect streams from erosion and provide shading. So therefore, there's a high value associated with that vegetation. And so here's some maps showing the cumulative sensitivity index for coldwater fish habitat. And some of the locations where we had high sensitivity scores include the Little Colorado River and its tributaries, some of the San Juan River tributaries up in the San Juan Mountains, and then the Rio Grande and its tributaries as well. And here's a cumulative sensitivity index for riparian corridors. And so some of the areas we found with high sensitivity are the main stems of the large rivers in the regions, so portions of the Little Colorado River, portions of the San Juan River, and the Rio Grande up in the San Luis Valley and in the middle Rio Grande near us here in Albuquerque. These areas all have higher sensitivity values. And so next here is the data set for the adaptive capacity for the coldwater fish habitat. And so first we looked at current coldwater stream temperatures, and this is using the northwest projections. So any stream segments that are currently projected to have mean August temperatures of 9 degrees or less are currently too cold for ideal trout habitat, but in a future warming scenario, they may become ideal trout habitat, at least in terms of water temperature. So these areas could have higher adaptive capacity. Next, we looked at riparian cover with the land fire, and we assume that riparian vegetation cover that has increased over time will provide shading and stream stability, which will help the fish in the future. Next, we look at shading cover, and this is riparian vegetation cover that is adjacent to streams. So we try to quantify how much of the riparian shrub and tree cover is actually over the streams or adjacent to streams, which is providing shade, since shaded stretches will warm less quickly than unshaded regions in the future. Then we included reservoir storage, since water stored behind reservoirs could be released in an adaptive management framework to provide both stream flow, volume, and temperature needed to increase trout survival. Then looked at stream gradient, since as Megan mentioned earlier, streams with higher gradient or more topography could be a little more difficult to implement adaptive management strategies. And so we use that in there, but looking at the percentage of stream segments that are affected by high gradient, it's extremely low. So most streams are below 20% gradient, so we might have to change that cutoff value in the future. And next, we created a variable of beaver capacity, and these are stream segments that have both low gradient and deciduous riparian vegetation. So these are areas where beavers can build dams, which can help native fish through adding heterogeneity to streams and by adding pools behind the dams, which can climate refugia, and also by making barriers downstream to prevent migrations of non-native species into reaches. So we use beaver capacity as an adaptive capacity measure as well. Next, we looked at herbaceous wetland cover, which can, since wetlands can store water to maintain stream flows during dry periods, and wetland vegetation also provides high bank stability as well. And then we quantified the amount of public land in the the percentage of public land, which is land that's managed by federal, state, tribal, and local agencies within each stream section catchment. And then we also looked at heavily protected land, and these are lands that are managed to maintain natural processes and natural communities along streams. And then finally, we looked at spring density, and springs are important to adaptive capacity because they can maintain perennial flows on a reach, and they can also provide climate refugia by maintaining cold stream temperatures. We have fewer adaptive capacity variables here. Again, we used elevation for riparian adaptive capacity, assuming that riparian corridors at higher elevations have less anthropogenic impacts, and so they may be easier to implement adaptive management strategies there. Reservoir storage, again, can help to maintain flows, both the timing and the volume necessary for riparian vegetation reproduction and survival. And then again, we looked at public land and protected land, which can help to implement adaptive management strategies. So here's some maps showing our cumulative adaptive capacity scores. And for the adaptive capacity for the fish in the Four Corners region, we found that a lot of there are a few segments with high adaptive capacity in the San Juan Mountains, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and the San Pedro Mountains of northern New Mexico. And for adaptive capacity index for riparian corridors, we found that there were streams near the San Juan Mountains and a few streams near the Sangre de Cristo Mountains that have high adaptive capacity values. So these are areas mostly at high elevations where conditions could be good for adaptive measures in the future. And once again, here's our process for converting these maps into vulnerability calculations. We combined our sensitivities and our exposure maps to create maps of impact values. Then then combined that with the adaptive capacity maps to create maps showing relative vulnerability of the stream segments in the regions. So I'll go over some of the results here. So the first is the vulnerability of cold water fish habitat in the regions. And we found that a higher percentage of stream segments in the Four Corners region had high vulnerability scores compared to the upper Rio Grande. And a lot of this is probably driven by the streams in the Little Colorado Basin, where there are some pretty heavy human impacts, and there's just fewer streams up in the high mountains, which will warm less rapidly. And here's some maps of vulnerability for these habitats. And we found that that high vulnerability scores, which are indicated by the orange stream segments there, are located in some areas of the San Juan Mountains, and some of the Little Colorado tributaries that drain from the Mogollon Rim are also coded as high vulnerability. And then some streams in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, especially those that flow east towards the Arkansas River and Canadian River drainages, also have fairly high vulnerability. Next is vulnerability of riparian corridors. And we found, looking at the percentages of stream segments, there weren't many differences here. Most of them were pretty low vulnerability overall. And here's some maps, and we found that some of the high vulnerability for riparian corridors were located along the main stem of the Little Colorado River, the upper San Juan River, and then the Rio Grande in Colorado and in New Mexico. So as you'd expect, some of these low elevation main stems have high vulnerability. There's a lot of anthropogenic impacts there, and there are also a lot of more endangered species and more sensitive species there as well. So some quick conclusions here from our initial analysis. We found that our assessment was able to reveal differences in vulnerability of native fish habitats between the focal regions, and we found that for the native cold water fish, there tend to be sort of a combination of some stream segments with low vulnerability in the San Juan Mountains, and alongside some streams with higher vulnerability as well. And we also found that there were low vulnerability in the mountains of northern New Mexico. So these could be good places to preserve the habitat that's there and to look at ways for adaptive management. we found that vulnerability of riparian corridors is greater at lower elevations, and this is where there tend to be higher human impacts, and these are also some of the more critical habitats, since there's such a big difference in the structure of riparian vegetation between these areas and upland areas. So, so as we'd expect, there's definitely high vulnerability and high conservation value in these habitats. And with that, I'll go back to Megan to discuss some takeaways.
All right, thank you, Max. That was very interesting. So I'm just gonna. I see that we have a couple questions. And so Mary, I see your comment now too, which was hidden there for a bit. So I think we're only 2 slides away from the end. So let me just wait on those a little bit longer, and then maybe we can address them all at once. So I'm going to close this out with just a couple takeaway thoughts here. I wanted to kind of reemphasize that we're creating these data products that are estimating exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity on these focal resources that can be used to identify potential management actions that may target any of those particular elements. And then they also can be combined in a variety of ways to assess vulnerability and opportunities across these landscapes. They're really meant to help identify critical areas of interest, importance, or priority within these landscapes. That said, I think it's important just to put this disclaimer out there that the outputs, these maps that we're producing and the data products, are not appropriate for local scale management decisions or conclusions. Rather, they're a broad scale approach to narrow down our attention to identify areas where perhaps we want to conduct additional fine scale studies or assessments. And they are usable to identify high action needs if you have an area that's under a lot of threats, for instance, or for identifying sensitivities or common areas of interest. And it's really here that where we hope to use these assessments to bring everybody together during our adaptation forums to talk a little bit about the mechanics and the uncertainties and what works and doesn't, and then to move forward with some of these results and identify priorities amongst the group that's sitting there at the table. And so as we start to think about these adaptation forums and think about the things that you've seen today, I've put up a couple questions here that I'd like you to consider. One, how do the results of these assessments match with where you're already working or your current priorities? Are you seeing things that relate to it, or is it new information? And secondly, think about how we can use this information to move forward to develop these collaborative actions and implement landscape conservation designs. And I have this cartoon here about innovative approaches, because I think that a lot of what resource managers and what we're being asked to do in the face of all this uncertainty is going to require some innovation of new ways to work together, and hopefully these assessment products can be a first step towards helping us do that. So I'm going to go to our final slide. If you have any comments or questions or want to communicate with us, our emails are here. You can write either one of us. And you can put in questions now. I don't know. I guess I'll address these and then, yeah.
Megan, it's Mary. Well, let's just answer these 2 questions in the exposure indicator box, and then I'll switch to the final layout for just open it to the general questions. How does that sound?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that sounds fine. So I think we answered the first question here. Then Garrett says a very interesting statement. I don't know if you caught this, Max, but mean summer flow seems somewhat helpful, but also might not tell the whole story. Projected days of low flow would be another exposure worth considering. So is that available?
That might be able to. We might be able to pull that out from the Norwest data. So that's something I'll definitely take a look at.
Yeah, and and I wonder. I don't know if you know this, Gary, but is there a source of information where we could identify a relevant change? Like, is it a decline, or is there information on the amount of flow or the number of days below which we can say this is a problem? You know, if there's that kind of information, that would be very helpful to know too, but maybe on the Norwest it talks about that. Yeah. So then I thought this was another interesting question. So interested in the temperature exposure index. And so are you using that? I guess in the streams, yes.
Yeah, stream
If I read correctly, this was set 1. If there was any increase in temperature, my question is, so did you do that? I think,
yep.
Okay, I wasn't sure, because I did that in my example, but that was a total mock-up, which I should have identified. I was just made up out of thin air somewhat. So my questions are, what projection method was used? And we didn't mention that, I don't think. And did you consider it a tiered approach where 1 degree increases less exposure than 2 degree? So as far as the second part, I can go ahead and say no, we did not. That, this is as basic of index as you could possibly make, but there's a lot of room for refinement, and I think that's a very interesting idea. Perhaps you're thinking of some specific examples. Do you know the projection method?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little. So for to make their projections, they started with the PRISM climate data, and the variable infiltration capacity model, or the VIC model, and they use those data to model effects of temperature and precipitation on stream flows for each segment. And then they applied basically a projected temperature increase across the entire basin to the segments, and to then get projected flow volumes for each segment. And I believe they use the A1B climate projection from the CMIP3 models.
And that's an example of one of the data sets that's been fully processed. So, that's what we have. You can't get alternate scenarios, and so, but it's a really nice data set. So, and then there was, somebody asked whether or not they missed some of the presentation, whether or not they could get a copy of it. And I think, Mary, you probably would mention this, but this is being recorded, and it will be available, and it will be posted soon. And there will also be, along with that, the draft assessment result, which contains a lot more detail that we felt was too much to cover in this time frame about where the data is coming from, how it was processed, and all that. Though you did do a good job of covering everything. So, okay. So now I think if there's any other questions or comments out there.
Yeah, and I'd like to let the audience know, feel free to ask a question by phone. All you need to do is unmute yourself and ask your question. And, I don't think, anyway, so you could do that, and if you have a question, go ahead and do that now, or else just type it in, and so we'll wait to see what questions pop up.
Yeah, how novel by phone. I forget we have this option.
Hi, this is Garrett. I have a quick question. How much, I'm planning on attending some of these other webinars tomorrow. Is this going to be relatively same format and the kind of same background information, I'm assuming?
Yes, the background information is going to be very repetitive amongst all 4 webinars. And so Zidal Wasserman will be the presenter for that. And so at the half-hour point or 20 minutes in, he'll start presenting the specifics with respect to the elk and mule deer.
Super. Well, thank you, everybody. I thought it was great to get some of that background. Thanks for putting this on.
Okay, I see somebody is typing, so we'll wait for that.
Here we have a question. So the question is, did the stream temperature estimates take into account changes in flow volume and flow timing over the year? And so that I'm not certain that they did. I think the temperature estimates were, definitely independent of the flow volume and timing. So we use 2 different data sets that, as far as I know, do not really incorporate those variables between the 2.
Any other questions by phone?
So yeah, since we're not getting a whole lot of commentary on the data, I assume that everybody is absorbing, and it sounds either it's a lot of information to absorb or everybody's happy with it, which would be great. But if you're thinking about this after you leave this webinar and you have some comments, please do contact us. especially if you're going to be at those adaptation forums and you would like to see something tweaked on this. This is your opportunity, so please let us know. And otherwise, I hope we do get to sit down with you all in a month or so. I guess a little over a month.
Yeah, Megan, Mary, this is John Rice. I just wanted to sort of fill in a little bit of the blanks here in terms of where and where we're going next and what we're doing with these. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the science coordinator for the Southern Rockies LCC. And the vulnerability assessments are really sort of the first of a number of steps that we're taking to try to help our partners make better or more informed decisions on where to do things and how they can best work together to get things done. And so once we've developed and finalized these vulnerability assessments, which you all are a very big part of today, so thank you very much for your comments and your review of these. We hope you will join us at the vulnerability or the adaptation forums to see the final assessments that we come up with and to make sure that we're still on the right track, because the exposure and sensitivity and adaptive capacity are sort of where we start. Our next step will be looking at those plausible adaptive actions that you might take to lessen the exposure, to lessen the sensitivity, and to improve the adaptive capacity of these species. And from that suite of actions, then we hope to develop a database of those actions that we would call an adaptation library, only because that's what other partners in our LCC have called it, and then work together to develop a conservation strategy that would facilitate the collaboration and cooperation so that the individual partners can achieve their own desired goals and outcomes. And so that's kind of why this is important. This is really the basis for all of that and where we hope to be going with this entire endeavor.
All right, thank you, John. That's helpful, too.
Well, no more questions have appeared in the chat box. So if there are no more phone questions, I'd just like to probably ready to wrap up. Don't you think, Megan and Max?
Oh, yeah, I think this is fine. Thank you, Mary.
Yeah, just a couple things. As I said in the beginning of the webinar, everything's recorded and will be posted on the Southern Rockies LCC website along with the presentation slides and the draft reports if they're available. And I'll follow up with everybody else in that stuff via email. And yeah, I just want to thank you guys for attending today, and thank you, Megan and Max, for presenting. It was very informative. Appreciate your time to do all this. Any other closing comments, Megan or Max?
No, I think we just hope to continue to hear from you. That would be good.
Great. And I'm going to leave the webinar open. If anybody wants to type anything else in the questions and comments, feel free. It'll be open for another 5 or 10 minutes. So other than that, I wish everybody a great day, and maybe we'll see you tomorrow on the next webinar or at the workshops. Goodbye.